I'm going to give a talk today on Huayan Buddhism and about a topic that has always been a confusing topic for me until I studied Huayan Buddhism, about sudden or gradual enlightenment. Do we get enlightened suddenly, or do we have to do it gradually? Before we get started, I wish everybody a happy Mother's Day. Mother. You should remember your mothers, because without your mothers, we're not here. And not only for birth, but also for all of their compassion, taking care of us when we're very little, and even when we get older and we need extra help. So there were four philosophical debates during the Tang Dynasty in China. We're not going to do all four of them, but these were the things that were of concern during the Tang Dynasty, which was one of the richest periods of time in China for the development of Mahayana Buddhism. For those familiar or not so familiar, there's the original teachings of the Buddha, and then those teachings of the Buddha after the Buddha passed away. Of course, there were many different teachers that came after the Buddha who went to different parts of India, and they formed different schools. There were 18 of them at one time, and they would come together for Buddhist councils. And during the second Buddhist council, there was a big controversy, not about any of these topics, but a group splintered off and went to Gandhara, which is in the Indus Valley, now part of Pakistan. And they developed what was called Sarvastivadin Buddhism. And from that group, we believe it was from that group that actually Theravada Buddhism went to Sri Lanka, and that group really wanted to remain faithful to the original Buddhist teachings, whereas the Sarvastivadin group had more modern ideas for that time. And that group eventually developed into what we now know as Yogacara, which eventually found its way into China. So this Yogacara was one of the main philosophical schools or branches of Buddhism that found its way into China, developed into several different schools there. The Bilun School, Northern and Southern, and Shilun School. So there are a number of different schools of thought. And as a result of all of these different schools, they had these different debates. The first one was how to organize the sequence of the Buddhist teachings. And they were organized into 5 different levels by many different schools. This was called Panjiao. 5 families, 5 different ways of being able to divide the different schools of the different sutras. So depending upon the school, if your school was believed in the Lotus Sutra, then you put the Lotus Sutra as the most important. If you believed in the Nirvana Sutra, you put that one top. If you believed that the Vantamsika Sutra was the most important one, you put that one on top. So the other debate was how to understand the one vehicle and the 3 vehicles. The 3 vehicles being the Shravaka vehicle, the ones that were the hearers that listened to the teachings of the Buddha and kept faithful to that. The Pratchika Buddhas who were self-enlightened, but went off and studied in forests, not interested so much in teaching. And then the Bodhisattva vehicle, those who renounced their own desire to become enlightened in order to be able to help others. So those 3 vehicles eventually became one vehicle, for some of the schools. Some of the schools kept the 3 vehicles. This became a big debate. The third one, which for me is the most interesting, is how to understand if people become enlightened suddenly or if it's gradual. That's the one we'll talk about today. And the fourth one was, which is a very technical debate, was if the consciousness, the storehouse consciousness in Yogacara, the Alaya Vijnana, is pure, how is it that you can get defilements? And if the Alaya Vijnana contains defilements, how can it ever become pure? So this was another debate. You can see that these are pretty heavy philosophical debates. Next slide. This major debate about sudden and gradual enlightenment, this would persist throughout and beyond the Tang Dynasty, was between whether enlightenment was sudden or gradual. If a person practices the moral purification and consistent with their meditation into deep concentration, would this necessarily lead to enlightenment? And apparently this is not true in most cases. So how is it that some practitioners reach awakening spontaneously? So one of the origins of the debate, in the next slide, was the problem of the 2 teachings of the sudden and the gradual enlightenment. Likely had its origins in some of the teachings of a monk by the name of Daoshan, who was tangentially involved with the translation of the Lotus Sutra with Kumarajiva and his group. Kumarajiva is a very big translator around the year 400. And Daoshan was a monk who promoted the idea that Ichantikas, or incorrigible, also had Buddha nature and could attain enlightenment. And this was an unpopular view at the time when Kumarajiva had his group. And Daoshan was initially expelled from the Sangha because of this belief. The translation group kicked him out, and he went up into the mountains to preach to the rocks. And they said he was such a good preacher that when he preached to the rocks one day, one of the rocks cracked open. So eventually he became known as Daoshan, who could crack rocks with his teachings. Well, someone brought a new translation of the sutra called the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. We'll call it the Nirvana Sutra. Brought this sutra to the translation group at Kumarajiva. When they took a look at it, they saw right in the text that it said, oh, incorrigibles, they also have Buddha nature and they can be awakened too. So they realized, oh no, we made a mistake. So they went up into the mountains and they found Daoshan and they brought him back. Had a big party, I'm sure. And Daoshan, being a good monk, did not have any resentment. He just continued his work with the group. A good teaching for all of us who sometimes are treated not fairly, and then not to create resentment in the heart. So the next slide, enlightenment and the Buddha nature. So the central question is whether a person is suddenly enlightened as a direct, non-conceptual realization of one's Buddha nature. Practice removes afflictions and obscurations, but it does not cause this awakening. By contrast, gradual enlightenment requires a progressive, step-by-step cultivation by way of moral discipline and meditation and concentration. However, there are deeper doctrinal questions. Is Buddha nature innate? Something that we all have, people are born with, or is it something that we cultivate? Is ordinary mind the same or different from the enlightened mind? Does continuous practice lead to enlightenment, or is it only a way of removing the obscurations, the afflictions, and the hindrances? Things like anger, hatred, greed, selfishness. Next slide. So, in the original Buddhist teachings, there are 4 stages of awakening on the Sravaka path, the path of the hearers. The first of the stream enterers. The next are the once returners, then the non-returners, and then finally an arhat. So there are these different stages where a person has different levels of awakening. So it's not just necessarily one awakening, maybe an initial awakening, and then other levels of awakening until they finally reach the level of arhat, which is that of fully awakened being. And the next slide. In Mahayana, a little bit different. In the awakening of the Mahayana faith, a distinction is made between initial enlightenment and an intrinsic or innate enlightenment. An initial enlightenment is a result of inner perfuming of the different levels of consciousness by one's Buddha nature and by practicing the teachings. The individual has a glimpse of non-duality and emptiness, but it's not lasting. An innate enlightenment is not to be obtained because of the original, because it's not something that you have to obtain or grasp onto. It's because you originally had this Buddha nature mind, and you just need to remove the obstructions that get in the way and clear the mind of those obstructions, and then the initial mind, the innate mind of awakening just emerges. So in the next slide, the awakening stages in Mahayana. In the Nirvana Sutra, there are 4 qualities that are acquired in the process of awakening: constancy, bliss, stability of self and non-self, and purity. I'm not going to go into those so much today. Just to say that stability of self and non-self means that one needs to be able to go through the world and maintain a sense of self only to a certain degree, and then at certain points, we need to let go of that sense of self, not take things so personally, and recognize the universality of all of us so we can interconnect and not be so self-absorbed. So we let go of this and have a sense of non-self as well. But when you're driving down the highway, you need a sense of self so you don't drive off the road. In the Avantamsaka Sutra, the Huayan Jin, this is the central teaching of the Huayan Buddhism. The 10 bhumis, or grounds, are the stages that lead to virtual enlightenment, the deep penetration into awakening, and then eventually to marvelous enlightenment, which is the ultimate Buddha stage. So there are 10 of these different stages that a person goes through in that particular training. So a little bit about the history about this, the sudden and gradual enlightenment debate. In the Chan school, so the Zen school, we encountered the problem of a poetry contest that took place between Shenxiu and Huineng around 668 or so. It was the same year of Master Jian's passing. Master Jian was the second lineage master of the Huayan school. And this poetry contest took place because the Chan master at that time, Hungren, he knew he was going to pass away soon, and he wanted to give his robe and bowl to his most advanced student, the one who had the greatest awareness. And everyone thought that that person would be Shenxiu because he had studied with the master for a long time. But there was this newcomer who had come from a small town, Huinan, was his name, and he was in the kitchen. And no one considered that he would become anything other than just a cook. And then when the master Hungren, he had an awareness that Huinan had this spontaneous awakening. So when the poetry contest took place, everyone thought that Shenxiu would be the one who would win. And he wrote his 4-verse gatha as his poem. And then Huineng, who was illiterate, asked someone to read it to him. And then Huineng dictated his own poem. And eventually, in the story, Huineng's poem was obviously seen as superior, and he was given the robe and the bowl, but then he had to flee the monastery up into the mountains because there were people who were jealous and thought that he had stolen it. That's a whole story in and of itself. You can read about this in the first part of the Platform Sutra. So the Shenxiu gatha. The body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a standing mirror or a mirror stand. Always try to keep it clean. Don't let it gather dust. So the dust is the afflictions. The idea here is gradual enlightenment. You always have to continue to keep your mind clear. Otherwise, the dust will get on it, and you will have the obscurations, and you won't be able to make progress. So Huineng wrote actually 2 gathas. The first one is the Bodhi doesn't have any trees. The mirror doesn't have a stand. Our Buddha nature is forever pure. Where do you get this dust? Later, he wrote, the mind is the Bodhi tree, the body is the mirror stand. The mirror itself is so clean, dust has no place to land. So you can see this is the sudden enlightenment view. One of the definitions of nirvana is that nothing can land on it. So this is all from the Platform Sutra. But later in the Platform Sutra, when Huineng gave his famous Platform Sutra Dharma talk years later at Dafan Monastery, he stated in section 16 that there's no sudden or gradual to the Dharma. Here's the actual quotation. My enlightened friends, there is no sudden or gradual to the Dharma. But some possess a keen nature, while others have a dull facility. The deluded practice diligently, and the deluded folks, they practice diligently and gradually, while the enlightened folks practice in the sudden way. To realize your own original mind is to perceive your own original nature. When you are enlightened, you will see that originally there is no distinction, but if never enlightened, you will remain in transmigration, remaining along in else. Basically saying there's no difference. But despite this, the Southern Chan school, which Huineng was involved in, became known as the Southern School. Southern School became the Southern School, and Shenxiu, who didn't fare so well in this contest, he went north to Chang'an, and which at that time was the capital, now modern day Xi'an. And he became involved with what was founded what was called the Northern School, the Gradual School. And he was very well respected in northern China, but being very close to the emperor and all of the political going on in that particular location, when the emperor changed, and then one of the emperors was not a big fan of Buddhism at all, and the support for the northern school was withdrawn, and it kind of faded into obscurity. Whereas the southern school was in the mountains in the south, far from the political drama, and so they were able to continue being a very strong school, and out of the teachings of Huineng, many different strong Chinese schools developed, 5 or 7 different schools, eventually coming back together again in 2 main schools, the Linqi School and the Taodong School, also known in Japan as Renzai and Soto. And they exist through to today. This is our Chinese school here. So the Southern School would thrive, and not so much for Shenxiu's school. The next slide, Huineng's approach to Southern and Gradual. So the Huayan approach, the Huayan school took a more integrated and nuanced view of Southern Enlightenment. Southern and Gradual were not seen as in opposition to each other, rather they interpenetrated each other without obstruction or duality. The Huayan had this idea of Indra's net, where there was this great net that covered the universe, and in every point in space and time, there's a little jewel, and that jewel reflects every other jewel. So everything is interconnected. All things in this way. Every phenomenon and every moment of practice reflects the entire path. The next slide. Southern within Gradual and Gradual within Southern. Both the Huayan and the Xiǎnkuān schools, another school that was very strong during this time, developed Southern within the Gradual and the Gradual within the Southern models to reconcile both views. Huayan and Xiǎnkuān shared the unified view that all being one and one being all. And a very famous Korean monk who was studying in China at that time with Master Jian, his name Wisong, and he states in a very famous poem and design that he made called the Ocean Seal Diagram, one is in all is in one is the same as all is the same as one. So the Xiǎnkuān school, Southern and Gradual, there's a Southern within the Gradual. One may follow the path of the gradual cultivation, and one can have a sudden realization of ultimate truth at any point. And then there's the Gradual within the Southern. Even after sudden awakening, one must continue gradually to cultivate the virtue wisdom and eliminate the residual afflictions and obstructions. So Master Jian, who is the second lineage master of the Huayan school, see how we're doing. He was the chief proponent of Huayan at that time. He needed to address these issues. In so doing, he referred to the one vehicle as the equivalent to the sudden teachings. And as previously quoted, the Gata from the Xiǎnkuān Sutra suggests a fourth vehicle, which is the one vehicle. This is from the Huayan or the Xiǎnkuān Sutra. If there are sentient beings whose minds are low and dull, for them he teaches the path of the Shravakas. If their minds are bright and keen, delighting in the Pratyeka Buddha path, he teaches them the middle vehicle. If there are those with compassion who delight in benefiting others, he teaches them the practice of the Bodhisattvas. If there are those with supreme wisdom in their heart, he reveals to them the unsurpassed Dharma of the Tathagata. So you can see how similar this is to what Hui Neng talked about in terms of teaching people at different levels. For those who speak Chinese and want to see if the translation was okay, here is the Chinese itself. Is okay? So, Zhong Mi, who is the fifth lineage master, actually the last of the Huayan school lineage masters, and there's a reason for that as well. But we'll get into that at another time. He was also someone who was recognized as a Chan master too. They would emphasize that he emphasized that although one awakens to the truth suddenly, the delusions that have been built up over countless kalpas are like old habitual patterns requiring diligent practice over the time to dissolve. So he was a fan of both sudden and gradual. So if I have a moment, I will say something about a scientific view of this, called the phase transition explanation of sudden and gradual awakening. So another way of understanding the transformation of the mind from an unawakened to an enlightened state is to see this as a phase transition. This is a concept in physics. So a phase transition occurs, for example, whenever water changes its liquid state into freezing or boiling. A technical terminology is that the phase of a thermodynamic system has states of matter with uniform physical properties such as solid, liquid, gas, or plasma. And when these phase transitions happen, they happen suddenly. You can put the water on the stove and you turn up the heat, and you can see at a point that it's not boiling, and then suddenly it's boiling, then it's boiling a lot. So in the case of a phase transition, certain properties, this is the next slide, of the state of matter changes due to, for example, changes in pressure and temperature. A liquid becomes a gas at a certain boiling point. However, the temperature is also affected by atmospheric pressure. For example, the boiling point of water is 212 Fahrenheit at sea level, but if 5,000 feet, water boils at 203 degrees Fahrenheit. At 10,000 feet, 194 degrees. This is because at higher altitudes, the air pressure is lower. The same is true for water becoming ice. Ice crystallizes suddenly at 32 degrees at sea level, but as the pressure drops at higher elevations, the ice forms at slightly higher temperatures. Pressure is something that matters a lot. So the relationship between pressure and temperature can be expressed mathematically here. I'm not going to go into the math. I don't want to create anxiety on Mother's Day. So the highest energy is the plasma field. So that takes a lot of energy to get to that plasma state. So in a way, by way of analogy, when the mind is under a lot of pressure, it's more difficult for the mind to change its state. Phase transition is obstructed. What causes the mind to be under pressure? Well, several factors can increase the pressure in the mind: immoral misbehavior, anger, strong cravings, attachments, upside down views. Of course, living in unsuitable circumstances such as war, fire, floods, and famine also create mental pressure. Of all the things that we can control, negative internal chatter caused by the afflictions and cognitive hindrances are the most damaging. And when a person learns how to lower this internal mental pressure by calming the mind, gaining insight into the wise principles, by increasing loving kindness and compassion, then the conditions for phase transition are more likely. The next slide. Linking the state of matter to different stages of spiritual and moral development is a unique way to illustrate how people can transform and evolve, moving from solid, rigid view of the world to a fluid and more expansive, gaseous state eventually, and finally to the interpenetrating, energetic plasma state, can serve as a powerful analogy for the journey toward enlightenment. Extending this example, one could say that the solid, frozen consciousness is the most defiled form, dominated by afflictions. The liquid state or fluid consciousness is more common and mundane, and a person aspires to be more wholesome and except when tempted by ego gratification and aversive circumstances. And then we get the next slide. It's a picture of plasma here. And the next slide. So in the gaseous form of consciousness is focused on a spiritual path, practicing morality, meditation, and developing wisdom. However, an overly goal-oriented pressure to become enlightened can also be an impediment. This is why the Bodhisattva forgoes personal enlightenment in favor of being a benefit for all beings. The plasma form is the greatest of the phase transitions, characterized by a sudden transformation into full awakening. This analogy would be one way of explaining sudden and gradual enlightenment, as enlightened plasma consciousness would be highly interpenetrating and without obstruction, accepting all diversity without bias, and very high in equanimity. This analogy would be one way of explaining the sudden and gradual enlightenment. Enlightened plasma consciousness would be highly interpenetrating. So, radiant light meditation, see how we're doing. Just at the very end of this, another Huayan teacher is named Xiǎnkuān. He was a Tang Dynasty layperson who was known for an extraordinary commentary called the Exposition of the Huayan Jing, the Bāṇ-Tamsika Sutras. And regarding meditation practice, Layman Lee, he developed his own version of meditation, which he called the Buddha light concentration, based on one of the chapters of the Huayan Jing, chapter 9. So in the next slide, the radiant light meditation, this depicted the light that emanated from beneath the Buddha's feet and was progressively illuminated the whole universe, depending on these descriptions for his interpretation. We attempted to trace that light in the mind He suggested that as the light expanded further and further, so that the conscious self extends and becomes universalized more and more until the self is unified with the universal light. Such a contemplative practice aims at the realization of emptiness or non-substance of the self. This is actually a painting that is found in the site called from the City of 10,000 Buddhas that has a translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And this is the picture that they use for that chapter that Lyndon Lee is talking about. So one other thing I will share is that many of these texts have never been translated into English. You know, Avatamsaka or Huayan Buddhism has been translated a few times. But the commentaries are not translated, and for me to translate one page would take several hours. Venerable Huineng, she can do it much faster. But the great translator called ChatGPT can translate Han Dynasty Chinese. It's amazing. Now, if you put Han Dynasty Chinese into Google Translate, you will get gobbledygook. But if you are able to put it into ChatGPT, it's amazing how good it is. The thing is that I have to put it in about 100 lines at a time, so that I can find the characters that I'm looking for in case I want to just do more specific understanding. Is this the right character, the right translation, or whatever? So it takes some time to do this work, and I'm looking for some assistance with that. So anybody who has an interest in learning how to put Chinese into, it's not so difficult, into ChatGPT, I welcome your assistance in this regard. You can do it remotely and just send me the sections that you've translated. But it's really remarkable. And even Venerable Huineng, she's using the ChatGPT. So I'm happy to train anyone in learning how to do it. You don't have to know Chinese to do it. Yeah. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy, which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity, which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Thank you all for your kind attention, and be sure to be especially kind to your mothers from now on.